dying to self, taking up the cross to follow Jesus. This, of course, is one of the hardest themes to preach from. Why? Because it carries one of the most radical sayings of Jesus. And I'm saying radical because if you look at the entire teaching that Jesus is giving, it is actually, in this ancient time, a manual for radicalization. If you have to do a parallel reading between this and the Al-Shabaab radicalization manuals, you will find lots of similarities. So today I stand here to radicalize you and to invite you to this radical teaching. And Jesus is not in any way apologizing about it. He's very serious and sincere about what he's saying. And he calls us first, before carrying the cross, to deny ourselves. To deny ourselves is to make ourselves total strangers to ourselves. Is to reject and refuse the persuasions, skillful persuasions of our flesh as a nature. When it's morning, the flesh feels like it wants to sleep more and enjoy the fluffy feeling of the blankets. When it's about food, the flesh feels like you want to eat more and more nyama choma, more and more syrup, more and more coke, more and more beer, more and more this and that. When it's basking under a hot and warm shower, the flesh feels it wants to continue in that feeling until senses tell you that this feeling is exploiting your pocket because you will pay through the power bills. So it is a call to deny the feelings of the flesh. Yet it is God who has created those feelings in us. God who has created that flesh. Denying yourself is resignation to yourself, total resignation. It is not momentary fasting like we are doing. In fact, John Wesley, our leader, was very, very worried about the fasting practiced in the Lent season. And if I may quote him, this is what he said: "Isn't there a danger in the practice of fasting in the Lent season for self-denial? That the practice of self-denial throughout the year will be undermined." So John Wesley was looking at Methodists in the Lent season and he was seeing how serious they were in fasting. And he was wondering, if this is the total concentration of fasting, isn't it undermining our practice of fasting in September, in November, in August, and in any other month of the year? And therefore, John Wesley called upon Methodists not to self-deny themselves just for a season, just for a while. To refuse social media just for a week or for a few hours. For John Wesley and for Methodists, it was self-forgetting, self-snob. You snob yourself and continually as a habit. And therefore, self-denial is like self-pruning. It is formational and it is directional. It directs you towards God continually. It sets you on the path that leads to the destination called God. It is formational because it forms you as a Christian to be mature and equipped in every situation to give an upright and Christian answer, to stand up for God in any situation that demands you as a child of God to do exactly that. And therefore, as we think about denying ourselves before we can carry the cross of Jesus, let us think in that mentality. Let us see if we can immerse ourselves into that water of self-denial baptism, if we can be baptized into that water. Let us think if we have faith enough. Do the teachings we get every Sunday, do the teachings we get from our estate fellowships, do the teachings that we get from our personal devotion and prayer, do they qualify for ingredients that make us strong and grown up in the things of God? A disclaimer as I continue, that self-denial is not an occasion for low self-esteem. If you have low self-esteem, some of it which is manufactured by our own self, it is not self-denial. This is not an occasion to feel under low. This is not an occasion to wear a gloomy face. This is not an occasion to boast in our affliction. There are people who are afflicted and they really want to boast. There are people who are fasting and they really want to show that they are fasting. This is not an occasion for self-abasement, for self's sake. It is an occasion for the glory of God. The story is told of a young girl who was coming from school one term, and she met a father, and she told the father, nowadays I'm so in love with Jesus. And the girl was expecting that the father will be so happy that my child now is so in love with Jesus. I am saved from the troubles of young girls growing up. But the girl was told this by the father. Ati, what? You are so in love with Jesus? What? That's very dangerous. That's what the girl was told. And she wondered why the father, instead of being happy that mtoto suddenly ameokoka na mpenda Yesu, why is the father warning me not to fall in love with Jesus? The father continued to tell her that when you fall in love with Jesus, as you're explaining it, expect this, expect self-denial, expect that it will not be business as usual. And she understood the point of what it meant to be in love with Jesus. And this is what Jesus is calling us for. In Mark chapter 8, the portion that we have read today, it's a very important session. The way Mark has structured his gospel is that Jesus is always on the move. And I think I've said this again in another sermon. If you read Mark's gospel, you feel that Jesus is always on the move. Pote alienda, akitenda member. He has no time, Mark has no time to tell us Jesus is brushing his teeth. He has no time to tell us that Jesus is sleeping and resting. He has no time to tell us about the luxury. It's always a fast-moving gospel. Rarely does Mark bring his Jesus to a standstill and to teach. We know Matthew's gospel, Jesus is a teacher by excellence. The Sermon on the Mount, 3 good chapters. 5, 6, 7, Jesus teaching. So in Mark's gospel, it is only 2 times that Jesus stops to teach. Chapter 4, and now this chapter. So in Mark's, when you're reading Mark's gospel, if you hear Jesus is teaching, useme wacha nisikize. Huyu jamaa amekuwa akitembea akiponya viwete, anaponya viziwi, anatembea, anafanya miujiza. But now Mark tells us Jesus is teaching. Wait and listen. And so he continues to teach, and he says to the disciples, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed after 3 days and rise again. Listen to that, he must be killed after 3 days. In the Apostles' Creed we say on the 3rd day. There's a difference between on the 3rd day and after 3 days. He spoke plainly about this, but when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan. Look at the teaching that is ongoing. That Jesus is teaching after the miracles is performed. If you read chapter 7, before chapter 8, he's already fed the 5,000. He's a celeb in the field, but now he has retreated in the silent places. And the gospel has been moving in a climax, and disciples really, do they realize what this climax is. But suddenly the Jesus they knew, the Jesus of the field, is turning into a different figure. And this, as it is called in chapter 8, is the first passion prediction, or the first death prediction for Jesus. We may take it lightly because we are reading a story continuing. But if we take it from the perspective of the disciples, these are people who have seen Jesus perform those miracles. These are people who are seeing that the world is suddenly changing. These are people who are filled with the hope when they look at Jesus in chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 4, chapter 2, chapter 1, when he's curing Peter's mother-in-law who had a fever and they are celebrating. But suddenly, Jesus tells them that the Son of Man must die. This was a remote idea. Nothing ever crossed their mind that this great person who raised people from the dead would ever die. And he tells them the Son of Man must die. Your enthusiasm must come to an end. This hullabaloo that you are seeing in the Son of Man must come to an end. And no wonder Peter takes him aback and rebukes him. Jesus, you cannot die. Why do you speak the language of death upon us, amongst us? But Peter is taken aback by Jesus and told, behind me, Satanos, behind me, Satan, for it must go as it has been written. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus has 3 predictions for his death, and they actually happen as he has predicted, that he's willing to go the way of suffering. So Jesus is not, as I said, a radicalizer, and I'm not calling Jesus a radical. He's not a radicalizer. Those radicalizers tell you to die, but for them they don't die. They send you to dangerous missions which they cannot go to. They are not like Netanyahu, who will take a gun and tell the soldiers in Israel, let's go and see how shooting feels. They are not like that. The radicalizers and the people in such illegal movements sit in their stools and they watch you as you suffer. Jesus is not like that one. He's telling them, I am the example. I will go before you. Before you suffer for the gospel, I will suffer for it. The Son of Man must be killed, and on the 3rd day rise again. So in this first prediction, Jesus teaches what his disciples never intended to hear. It's contrary to their flesh, contrary to their feelings. They were saying that the fortunes must be gathered. But he says, no, it will be different for me. It will be different for those who are called children of God. And this is exactly people who have suffered for the gospel have realized. That the gospel has a suffering element. And the gospel has a glory element. There are 2 conflicting theologies in the gospel. The theology of the cross, take up your cross and follow me, and the theology of glory, from where many in our age want to settle on. The theology of glory tells you, you shall be lenders and not beggars. Hallelujah, you shall prosper. You shall decree and declare. You shall step on the scorpions and you shall not die. You shall drink poisons. You lift only statements that speak of the theology of the glory. The gospel of Jesus Christ is never full gospel. If you have attended that church, it's never full gospel, if this is what they mean, if it does not balance the theology of glory and the theology of the cross. When we suffer many times. We want to say it's devil, it's Satan, it's what? The child of God must not suffer. Even the vows that we come to make here when we're doing weddings, some of us mock them. Pastor, I will not say those vows because I don't believe for poor